To the RJ Cubed panel discussion. My name is Claire Samuelson and I'm a 3L at Penn Law. I'm on the board of If, When, How Lawyering for Reproductive Justice. And we're so happy to be co-sponsoring this event with the Black Law Student Association, Penn Law Women's Association, and Penn Law Feminists with funding support from the University of Pennsylvania Law Review. I'm very excited to welcome our panelists. We have Lydia Caradonna, a writer, founding member of Decrim Now, and sex worker from the UK. Victorialaw is an author, freelance writer, and editor. Leigh Goodmark is the Marjorie Cook Professor of Law and Director of the Gender Violence Clinic at the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law. And moderating our event, we have Professor Dorothy Roberts, the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology, and the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossel Alexander Professor of Civil Rights here at the University of Pennsylvania. If you're seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE codes will be announced twice during the event via a poll question. Write down these codes and be sure to enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The form is mandatory to receive CLE credits, and the link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email, but if you did not receive it, find it in the chat, and these codes will tell us how long you have attended. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Roberts.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Claire. I'm so excited about this panel, the subject, and the really terrific panelists that you brought together for this conversation. Some of the most important, exciting, inspiring people in this movement against prisons and carceral logics. And so I wanted to jump in by asking all of you, what is carceral feminism? Before we talk about an anti-carceral approach to violence in particular and other kinds of harms that we experience in our society, both in our homes and outside our homes, both by people we know and love and by the state. How do you define carceral feminism? So Professor Goodmark, do you want to kick us off with that, and then we can all jump in and talk
Absolutely. And first, I just want to say thank you so much for including me on this panel. I said on Twitter the other day, if I had just gotten to watch this panel, I would have been thrilled. To be part of it is beyond. So thank you so much for inviting me. Carceral feminism is a term that was coined by Elizabeth Bernstein in the context of the trafficking movement, actually, but one that has been widely adopted, I think, by many of us who do anti-violence work. And it refers to the tendency of some feminists to believe that state intervention, and specifically punitive state intervention through the criminal legal system, and I know, as Vicki will talk about later, all of its many adjuncts, is the appropriate way to address various kinds of social problems, including intimate partner violence, rape, sexual assault, and trafficking. So the idea is that we trust the state through the criminal legal system to intervene appropriately and in ways that serve victims well. And that is, I think, something that we could all critique at quite a bit of length.
Yes, and we do want to critique that as we move along. Well, first of all, does either of the other panels, do you want to say anything more about what carceral feminism is? Feel free to, if you want to add anything to that.
Well, first, go ahead, Lydia. Oh, no, I was saying, do you want to go first? Oh, okay. The way I sort of perceive carceral feminism as having taken hold is in this conception of a separation between the state and community, this idea that the state is not something that belongs to us and it's not something that we participate in, and that when harm happens, it stops becoming our business and becomes the business of the state to kind of step in and regulate it. And I think it also comes from the fact that the way the state operates in our lives we don't tend to have a role model in our communities of power beyond the actions of the state. We don't see collective power very often. We don't see personal power very often. So when people are feeling not very empowered because something horrible has happened to them, the automatic way lots of us will try and address that and try and reclaim some power is by wielding the state as a form of harm and using it as a weapon. And I think it probably took hold because of an issue with activism, in that the first people in any group of oppressed people who are able to challenge the state are the people who have their needs met, right? So back when I was doing street work, was not able to get involved in activism. It's only since I moved up to brothel work that I've been able to do anything. And people who are most in danger or struggling don't get to intervene first in these movements. So the privileged people who the state is working for in many ways are able to define how we kind of view justice. So because they were already enactors of the state, it sort of developed in that sphere, and we never got to reclaim it.
Yeah, those are interesting points. Who gets to imagine what the responses should be makes a big difference, and what is available makes a big difference too. I agree that a lot of times people will say, well, who else can we turn to? We have to turn to the police, but that's because that's what's made available to us. And can we imagine something different? Vicki, did you want to say more about either what carceral feminism means or how it ended up that movements to end gender-based violence partnered so much with law enforcement? How did we get here that becomes the dominant approach to how to address violence? You know, turning to the state that perpetuates violence.
Yes. Yes. Well, I think that one of the things that carceral feminism conveniently ignores is the way that being marginalized in society by a race, by a class, gender identity, immigration status makes women more vulnerable to harm. And then when you ignore this, it becomes another tool to criminalize survivors who don't fit this perfect victim narrative or idea of who a perfect victim is. Is a person engaging in criminalized actions? Oh, they're not a perfect victim. Are they Black? Are they a woman of color? Does not fit the perfect victim narrative, you know. And then at the same time, what carceral feminism does is it increases the power of the state. It ignores all of the other things that women and survivors of violence of all genders, but also, so it ignores the question of why is it that in many societies, when we're talking about domestic violence and sexual assault, why is it that women are the ones that are most often the ones who are the victims? Why is that? It's not because, you know, they are born with giant targets on their foreheads. What is it about our society that says it is okay to hit this person that you say that you love, but when you're mad, most people don't go and punch their bosses. When you get a traffic ticket, you don't go and punch the cop, you know. But if you are somebody who has been conditioned to think that this person that you supposedly love, you know, is an okay target, you go home and you take your frustrations out on them. You don't take it out on people who are in power or people who you perceive as being your societal equals. So carceral feminism doesn't address that question. It just says, you know, we have these people and they need to be locked up, you know, for everybody's protection. And then it also doesn't look at all of the ways in which society fails to provide resources that enable people who are vulnerable to violence, women and other people, to be able to escape those relationships or disentangle themselves from those relationships, or even to say, I may love this person, but I want this harm to stop. And what are the things that need to happen for this to stop? Maybe we need to have separate households. Maybe I need to have some sort of economic support that allows me to disentangle myself economically from this person so they don't control my purse strings. And we're also, carceral feminism just outright ignores the ways in which race and class and all of the other societal oppressions play into further criminalizing people when police are called. I mean, in 1980, there were 25,450 women in jails and prisons. I want to be clear that that's people in women's jails and prisons, not immigrant detention centers, not juvenile detention centers, and not trans women in men's facilities. But today, using that same rubric of people in women's jails and prisons, there's over 225,000. So carceral feminism also does not, in the US, so carceral feminism does not look at, you know, how does this increased reliance on policing and prosecution increase women's incarceration as well? How does this, you know, how does the hammer also fall on these people that we're supposedly trying to protect?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that raises a number of issues about who, not only who gets punished
Mm-hmm.
by a carceral approach, but also who are people who are vulnerable to the violence in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we could tease that out a bit, because you've raised the issue of who are the survivors of violence and what is the approach to the perpetrators of violence. So let's look at who are the survivors. What is it about our society? And Vicki, you raised this question about what is it about US culture and society and politics that makes women in particular more vulnerable to certain types of violence. Maybe we could look at that more broadly and ask, does a carceral approach harm the survivors themselves? So let's break it down into who are likely to be survivors of violence. We live, as you were pointing out, I think all of you have pointed out, in a society that is deeply marked by inequalities and unjust hierarchies of race, of gender, with transphobia, sexism, classism. That has an impact on who is both punished and who experiences violence and in what ways. So how do you connect the experience of violence and these social inequities and political inequities? And I'll just open that up to whoever wants to jump in with that. I know, Vicki, you already started the conversation about that, but I'd like to explore it some more.
So I guess one thing I would suggest first is that the idea that there is a binary between people who do harm and people who are harmed is deeply problematic. That in fact, many people who are doing harm have experienced harm themselves, and many people who are being harmed have also done harm to others. So, you know, we had coming, you asked a question before, Professor Roberts, about the history here. And the history, at least in the intimate partner violence space, is very much this narrative of domestic violence is about the desire to have power and control over one's intimate partner. The person who is doing the harm is always male. The person who's being harmed is always female. In that original conception, it was a very kind of deeply gendered and deeply binary gendered kind of understanding of what violence was. And it cast the people who were doing harm as monsters, irredeemable monsters who needed to be locked up so that they could not do harm to other people. And had the effect of casting, as Vicki said earlier, people who were harmed as angels, who had to conform to this idea of a perfect victimization in order to be able to get the assistance of not just the criminal legal system, but also shelters and other kinds of services. And so we've had in operation this victim offender binary that serves no one particularly well. It doesn't serve those who do harm well because it does not recognize the trauma that they have experienced, which may be a way to help them change their behavior, which is something we don't talk about very often. And it doesn't recognize the ways in which victims of violence often become criminalized, both because of things that they do affirmatively and because of their relationships with their partners, which was, Beth Ritchie's original Compelled to Crime in 1996, and straight through from there, understanding particularly the ways in which Black women were brought into the criminal legal system as a result of their relationships with abusive people, but also because of their attempts to use the carceral system itself. And so when you call the police, as Andrea Ritchie's work shows us, your chance of having a positive interaction with that policing entity is deeply affected, not just by your status as a victim of intimate partner violence, but also particularly your race and particularly your gender identity. And so, this idea that there is a victim offender binary, it's problematic, and it's deeply problematic, particularly for criminalized survivors who, because they, especially when they have done something considered to be criminal, no longer get to be seen as victims. And if you look at, I'm writing a book on this now. This is the stuff that I'm working on now. And when you look at, for example, prosecutors' statements in the trials of women and trans and gender nonconforming people who are convicted of crimes, what you see is this distancing from that perfect victim narrative, that they were not really a victim because they were angry. They were not really a victim because they were jealous. They were not really a victim because they acted, because they had agency. They were not really a victim because they were Black. They were not, and this stuff comes through in the statements that are made by police and prosecutors about people who have been harmed and then come into contact with the criminal legal system. So all of these things are operating anytime law enforcement, police, prosecutors, courts, parole officials, kind of across the board, comes into contact with a survivor of violence.
Yeah, that's such an important point, that the politics of all of this and the deep inequalities and injustices that exist criminalize whole populations of people, and it's the criminalization, it's not that is harmful. It's not. You're absolutely right. I think that people are seen as worthy victims if they fit a particular position within these hierarchies. And it's not at all the case that the way that criminalizing ends violence, addresses violence, it could produce even more. I want to emphasize your point that for Black women, for example, we are at risk of being injured, assaulted, killed by police officers in calls for assistance in intimate violence situations, and also at risk of being assaulted by police apart from that. And less likely to be seen as worthy victims in a case of assault in court. So I really appreciate your point that this binary is not helpful. And I think, Vicki, you also emphasized the idea of who is the perfect victim that gets the support of the state. It's completely based on these unjust hierarchies that are at the root of the violence to begin with, right? I don't know, Lydia, if you wanted to, go on, please.
I was also going to say the carceral approach also depends on this idea that people who are harmed want the person who has harmed them to be locked up and locked away from them. So I mean, Aisha Shahida Simmons did an amazing anthology called Love with Accountability about ending child sexual abuse in the Black community, or in Black communities and Black families, understanding that child sexual abuse is a huge problem. But also criminalization and the hyper incarceration of Black people is also a huge problem. So how do you keep people safe? And she talks about being sexually abused by I think it was her grandfather as a young girl, and she never wanted him locked up. She wanted the abuse to stop.
Right.
And it's like, and almost everybody in that anthology talks about how they experienced sexual abuse as a child at the hands of a loved one or a trusted community member. None of them wanted the person doing this harm to be locked up. They did not want to see them caged. They did not want to see them jailed. They did not even want to see them exiled away from them. They just wanted the harm to stop. They wanted that person to be their loving grandfather or their trusted, community member or neighbor. They did not want to be abused by that person. So the carceral approach also leaves out lots and lots and lots of people who say, I don't want this person to be caged. I don't want them to be locked up. I don't even want them to be banished from my life.
Yeah.
I just want them to stop hurting me and to stop hurting others. So the carceral approach leaves out who knows how many survivors who never ever turn to police and prosecution.
Yeah, that's an important point, that the carceral approach is not an approach that attends to what survivors want. And in fact, there's lots of evidence it doesn't even work to stop violence to begin with. And the way in which survivors who don't want to cooperate with the state may end up being punished themselves for their lack of cooperation, right? So in all those ways, it's not attending to the survivors' interests. It's attending to these forces of criminalization that are targeting certain groups of people. Lydia, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything Victoria was just saying. The reason I was invited today is because of an article I wrote called I Don't Want My Rapist to Go to Prison. And I think it's really important to conceptualize violence and harm in a way that includes the justice system as part of that. So some of the points that I made were that, well, first of all, I don't have the power to go to the police about anything. I work in an illegal brothel. Some of my rapists have been involved in law enforcement. Like I don't have the power to in the first place. But if I did, the way that the justice system has set up how we deal with sexual violence, if you're lucky to have it taken seriously at all, is a re-traumatizing process. And it's a process that once again takes power away from the survivor. I didn't have the option to go to a sexual assault referral clinic because they would have forced law enforcement to be involved. I went to a hospital to try and get help, and they tried to call the police and then tried to call social services because I didn't want the police. Like all of this stuff was re-traumatizing. And if you do cooperate with law enforcement, then what's the process? So you go and recount your traumatic experience to strangers who look for holes in it. Then you have to go and face possibly your rapist in court, and then a whole panel of people while a lawyer tries to prove that you're a liar or you deserved it. And then someone else decides the punishment and decides what is going to be done to make things right. And then it's considered case closed and you're supposed to just get over it. Whereas that doesn't help, especially doesn't help with intimate partner violence or violence within the family, because then you are losing your whole family, you're losing your lifestyle, you're losing all the things you had before. So it's not something that is going to put things back to normal or transform things into something better. It's still going to cause you to lose. And I think honestly it's probably a worse experience than most people, unless you're one of the very, very, very few people who somehow goes through all of this and then feels safe and feels like justice has been done and you can move on. You're still left without the resources you need. You're still left without access to therapy or the resources to be able to take time off work and deal with things. Like people don't have that. And it seems to be that the entire like ethos of punishment with these sorts of things, kind of going back to the idea that there's people who do harm and there's people who are harmed and then that's it, is that we seem to have this attitude that, oh, well, this person's doing harm, so they can't be in our site anymore, so we'll ship them off somewhere, and then we don't have to worry about it as a community. When, like, our rapists are part of the communities we're in. It's not something we get to kind of like push away and make it someone else's problem.
Yeah, that, you know, what you're saying, Lydia, reminds me of what a bad moderator I am, because I never asked you all to begin by telling us how you got involved in this work and your story about how you were personally involved and came to understand the harms of a carceral approach in your own case, you know, that, and your own life is so important. And thanks for giving us, just in that short time, so many ways in which addressing violence through police, prison prosecutors fails. You know, not only fails, but it harms the people who were harmed in the first place. So I want to give the others too a chance to say some more about your work in this field. I do want to turn, we're about halfway through this first part before we get to Q&A, and I do want to turn to what we do about this, to discussing transformative justice as a different approach, a radically different approach to carceral approaches. But I wondered if you'd like to say something about your work opposing a carceral approach before we move into what's a better way of dealing with violence.
Vicki, do you want to go? Do you want me to go?
Go
All
ahead.
Right. So I have been representing victims of violence for 25 years. And when I came to this work, believed deeply in the carceral approach, believed absolutely that people who did harm were monsters and they deserved to be locked up. And it was really in working with clients on a day-to-day basis that I learned that, in fact, clients did not see their partners this way, that their opinions about their partners were much more complicated. I used to love doing divorces because I thought, here it is, it's the last legal tie between this person and her partner, and it's all going to be great after this. And one of my clients said to me, no, I didn't want this. I didn't want to be divorced. I didn't see my life being this way. And being in the courts day in and day out really exposes you to how badly the legal system fails and the many, many ways that it fails to understand what justice means for particular people who've been harmed, particular victims of violence, and what they need, and how little of that the system can provide. So I'm a clinical law professor. And in my clinic, we represent folks in matters involved in intimate partner violence, in trafficking and rape and sexual assault. And in the last and so I was, coming to question the legal system over time, wrote a book in 2012 that kind of moderately questions the legal system, I would say. And then 6 years ago, started representing criminalized survivors and spending a lot of my time in prison. And once you have done that, I defy you to be able to look at criminalization the same way. It's what Brian Stevenson calls becoming proximate to the problem. And I know that sounds cliched at this point, but it really is true that once you have seen people locked up, you have to think differently about what it means to say that someone should be locked up. And so that's been true for me and true for my clients. And coupled with my academic research, which in 2018, I wrote this book called Decriminalizing Domestic Violence that makes the argument that Professor Roberts laid out, that in fact, the criminal legal system is not decreasing rates of intimate partner violence. It's not deterring intimate partner violence. In fact, it exacerbates many of the correlates of intimate partner violence, and it has serious unintended consequences for criminalized survivors. And the research it's really not that hard to lay out, because I will tell you that as unhappy as my book makes people, no one has told me that I'm wrong about the research. And what the research says is that since the real adherence to the criminal legal system in the United States, rates of violence have not fallen significantly. They, as compared to the drop in the overall crime rate. So rates of violence have fallen quite a bit. All rates of violence have fallen. And at the same time that we've been putting hundreds of millions of dollars into the criminal legal system to address domestic violence specifically, rates of all violent crime have actually fallen more than the rate of intimate partner violence, which should make you question whether that is money well spent. There's no social science evidence suggesting that arrest or prosecution have a strong deterrent effect, if any, on intimate partner violence. There's no social science evidence suggesting that incarceration has a deterrent effect on intimate partner violence. And so we are selling victims a false sense of security and a false sense of justice by telling them that the carceral system is going to provide them with those things. So for me, it was my work as a lawyer and working with clients day in and day out in these systems, my academic research, and then my work in the carceral system itself that has me, as Vicki knows, my Twitter handle now is Recovering Carceral Feminists, Ask Me How, because I would absolutely have put myself in that place 25 years ago, and I am very much not there now.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad I eventually came around to asking the question. And please, everybody, call me Dorothy, okay? So yeah, it's amazing how there's so much reluctance to give up on a carceral approach when there's absolutely no evidence that it works. And in fact, there's lots of evidence that it makes things worse. So that social science evidence about, locking up the perpetrators of domestic violence doesn't work. There's evidence that in the case of Black women in particular, it makes things worse. So, and that may be true for other people as well, but certainly no evidence. We know that it doesn't do any good. Why are people so reluctant to give up on things that we know do no good?
Because they're afraid.
Yeah.
The reason it's two things, I think. In the feminist anti-violence community, it's partly because people invested so much of themselves in getting that response to happen. That was a huge push of the anti-violence movement, was to get the carceral system involved. And then it's fear. It's somebody said it earlier, like, we think that the police are doing something. They're not, but we think they are. And whenever you have a defund conversation, it's always, but who will save us from rape and who will save us from domestic violence? And my hobby is to put on Twitter these stories about police officers who commit intimate partner violence, because they're not even saving their own partners from these things. How can we expect them to save anyone else? Law enforcement is an after-the-fact solution that doesn't prevent anything and often is more harmful for lots of different reasons. But people are afraid, and they want some answer as to what is going to replace what we currently have. And to the extent that nobody has the answer, people are reluctant to move away from carcerality.
I agree. I absolutely agree. People want to know, what else can we do? And a big part of the problem is we haven't given people sufficiently. We're trying, but our voices also don't have the kind of amplification that the carceral voices have. But the more we can work on imagining and building something radically different that we can show works better to make people safer, the more we'll be able to advance this cause. But let me give Vicki a chance to, and that's what I want to move now to what we should be doing instead, but I want to give Vicki a chance to say how she got involved in this struggle.
Well, I just want to respond to two things to Leigh, is that, to Leigh's point, is that, there's the amplification of the message that you have the police or nothing, right? Like, what stops violence? Either you go to the police or you just sit there and you suffer. So that is like the amplified message that has been hammered into us generation after generation after generation. Now, there are many marginalized communities throughout the United States and probably throughout the world that know that this is not the case, right? Black communities, terrorized by white supremacists, know that the police are often the people who terrorize you. So this is not, but the amplification of the message around gender violence is police or nothing. Call the police or do nothing. And then also, people want a solution that doesn't necessarily involve them, because we've been also trained to think the solution is outside of us. I have done, I don't know, a lot of interventions. People cannot see this, but I am 5 feet, until the pandemic, I was 95 pounds. I am slightly rounder than that now. But I am not a large person. But also, I feel that, like, if I see something happening, I intervene.
Mhm.
And I try to figure out how to do it safely. So I don't like throw all 95 pounds of myself at some guy that's yelling at his girlfriend, but I might be like, hey, do you want to come stand over here? Or, hey, like something's happening with, my neighbors. What if I round up 2 other of my neighbors and go knock on the door, and just be like, hey, is everything okay? But these are things that are uncomfortable. They are scary, it is so much easier from the distance and comfort of your house to pick up the phone and call 911 and drop an anonymous tip than it is to be like, okay, this might be weird, this might be awkward, somebody might punch me in the face, but let me go and figure out how to do this. Or let me try to talk to my neighbors and be like, hey, what can we do when we hear this? And, so we have been trained to think we need to go think that people over there will save us, and the people over there are the police and the legal system. So, so those are the 2 points I wanted to add to what Leigh has brilliantly laid out, is that there's this giant conditioning that we have to undo. And that conditioning came over, years and years and years. So we're not going to undo this tomorrow, unfortunately. So quick way I came to this, I've been doing work and reporting on and writing to and being in touch with women incarcerated around the country, cisgender women in women's jails and prisons, and maybe a dozen or so trans women in men's prisons. And again and again and again, violence and trauma have been the crux of their story, from when they were small up until, adulthood. And then prisons continue this type of violence. So even if they are never outright sexually assaulted, being in prison is a daily, it's a sexually abusive environment. You have to do things like strip in front of other people, to be able to go to visits. You have to put up with pat down searches. You have to put up with people looking at you on the toilet. So again and again and again, I was reminded that prisons are sites of abuse, and people who end up in prisons, particularly people who end up in women's prisons, but probably also a large number of people who end up in men's prisons as well, cisgender men or trans women, have survived abuse before. They have prior histories of abuse that happened way before. So it was, and some of the research that has been, done on abuse in prior abuse for people in prison has shown this, that the majority of people are survivors of abuse. So it was, something that's, showed me that you can't rely on law enforcement. And this is something that me growing up as a child of immigrants knew, is that you never called police. You never relied on law enforcement to come save you. You just dealt with it however you did, but you did not actually ever invite the state into your house to deal with problems.
Thanks. So now everybody knows how even more magnificent this panel is than when we began. So let me move to the next phase of our discussion. I think that you three have done a brilliant job of pointing out all the failures of a carceral approach to violence, especially as we've been focusing on intimate violence and sexual violence. Let's turn to what is just as essential, which is, what do we do instead? And I want to talk about the approach, and feel free if this isn't how you think about it and you have other ways of thinking about it, but I wanted to use the term transformative justice as a way we can think about ending, reducing violence without relying on police and prisons and prosecutors. So can you tell us how you define transformative justice, if you think that's a useful way of thinking about how we should be dealing with violence? And also, there are a number of terms that are used by people in this movement. Some refer to restorative justice, and I know that I myself have criticized some aspects of restorative justice because it often is done within the criminal justice, so-called justice system, relies on it. I've worked on what it means for Black women who are charged with crimes related to their children. And often they're seen as being criminals, innate criminals, and restorative justice just means degrading them. And I don't, that may not be necessary, but I've often seen it almost uniformly connected with law enforcement. So I find that transformative justice sometimes is distinguished from that in that way. But I'd love to hear what you all think about that transformative justice as an approach to intimate violence. Maybe Lydia, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so the way that I and like my communities perceive transformative justice is often less about the one incident and more about what we can learn from that incident to affect change on like a wider level. So say in circumstances of sexual violence, looking at what caused it, as in what attitudes people have held that have enabled it to happen, what resources people need to give them power to avoid situations that have made them vulnerable, and then kind of using that to challenge all of the things that might cause it to happen again. Sex workers have an interesting relationship with restorative justice, similar to what you were saying, Dorothy, in that I don't know a lot about in the US, but in the UK, lots of us, if we get caught up in raids or for soliciting on the street, we can be sent to programs where we learn how to be good women again. So we'll learn homemaking skills, and we'll be taught to do laundry or to sew, so that we have like moral lives that don't rely on us degrading ourselves. So I definitely agree with what you were saying about restorative justice falling short and often being harm in itself. And I think also restorative justice often kind of suggests that harm that has happened is this aberration that should never have happened, and like it's never going to happen again, and we just have to put things back the way they were before. But the way things were before caused the harm to happen. The way things were before, say I got into a situation at work and the restorative justice happened, I would still be in a situation at work. I'd still be in the sex industry because I'm poor, right? I would still not have any of that access to the things I needed to not be in a vulnerable situation in the first place. So yeah, I suppose they could maybe happen at the same time, but I think just relying on restorative justice and saying this is the way that we fix harm is so flawed.
Yeah, thanks. Either Leah or Vicky, do you want to?
Yes.
Please go.
Thank you, Lydia. And we also have similar programs in the United States, I'm very sorry to say.
Yes.
You know, like the US has a long history of locking up women who are, you know, perceived as exercising their sexuality and sexual behavior, whether it be like, you know, locking them up in reformatories for having sex outside of marriage or contracting an STD. And then more recently, we have these ridiculous sex worker rescue and diversion programs. For my most recent book, I actually interviewed a woman named Monica Jones in Arizona who had been caught up in a sex worker diversion program that had been started by social workers at the University of Arizona, where once a month they paired with the police and they rode around town and they picked up women that they perceived to be sex workers, which largely targeted women of color and trans women of color. And then they were brought to a church, not a precinct, they were brought to a church. They were not told they had the right to a lawyer. They were not given a lawyer, and they were told, we can either book you on sex work charges, or you can enter this program called Project Rose, where we teach you to be like, I don't know, a non-sex working person.
A respectable.
Like, yes, like, and I'm not sure if they got taught how to do laundry and whatnot, but they weren't, it wasn't like, we're going to give you a job that pays you a living wage so that you don't have to do sex work. It's like, we're going to teach you all of these things and you have to come to this program. And, like, we're not going to give you any money to work, or to pay your bills while you're in this program. And in Arizona, the penalties for sex work are kind of steep. I think it's something like the first misdemeanor conviction is 15 days, the next one is 30 days, the next one is 60 days, and then after that it jumps to a felony. So you don't want to start racking up sex work convictions. So a lot of people are like, yeah, so I'll go to this, diversion program that ends up being this rescue model that doesn't actually rescue you. At the end of the program, you're not given $1 million so that you don't have to do sex work anymore. You're not given a house. You're not, given a job. You're just told, like, okay, now you have some skills so you can go work at McDonald's. If McDonald's will hire you, great, wonderful. So I think that when we're looking at, transformative justice, it is changing those conditions. What pushes people into doing criminalized activity? And then also, when I interviewed Monica Jones, she said something very interesting, which we heard again and again from people who've been criminalized, is, what would help? And she's like, if people aren't being bothered, don't, just leave them alone. Like, why, like, decriminalize sex work, decriminalize drug use. These are all things that it's like, they're not bothering anybody else, leave them alone. Like, they are people trying to survive, whether it's like economically survive or, do other things. So part of transformative justice is, would people be disproportionately attacking sex workers if sex workers were legal? If sex work was not criminalized, stigmatized, and viewed as like, oh, you are somehow less than. So if you decriminalize sex work, that removes a barrier, or removes a, whatever you call it, incentive for people to be like, if I target this person, nobody will care. Like, I can't go target the Park Avenue matron, but I can target this woman over here who's just off Park Avenue because she won't report, and even if she does, nobody will care. So it's like, what do we do to change the conditions where some people are always more vulnerable to violence and other people are not? And I'm not saying like make everybody more vulnerable to violence. I'm saying that, like, how do we make everybody less vulnerable to violence? How do we start erasing those conditions?
Yes, thank you.
So I would add to that. I see transformative justice as part of kind of a suite of community-based strategies that we need to be thinking about. And restorative justice is one tool in that suite, but is not the only thing. And one of the unfortunate things I think that happened after the Me Too movement was that people started talking about restorative justice as though it was the thing that was going to replace all of the other problematic things. And you could somehow take the criminal legal system and move it to the side and then plunk down restorative justice, and that was going to solve the problem. That's clearly not the case for so many different reasons. But I think that if done outside of the state and done properly, restorative justice can be part of an overall transformative justice strategy. And it is being used particularly in communities where you have small ethnic, religious, geographic, other folks who are going to be interacting with each other and can't go to the state for whatever reason, and don't want to go to the state for whatever reason, but need to reorder their relationships in some way. And restorative justice can be useful in doing that. So I think what's interesting is that, what you hear about are the carceral-based diversion programs called restorative justice that I would argue are not really what restorative justice was meant to be. What you don't hear about are the underground programs that are operating in communities all over the country because the anti-violence movement has been so opposed to them. Because there have been such grave concerns about doing restorative justice in response to intimate partner violence. And that's a much kind of longer conversation. But I would say, thinking about transformative justice for me is thinking about conferencing and doing that kind of restorative justice work, but also thinking about the work that Mia Mingus has done around pod mapping, and and it's kind of what Vicki referred to, right? Who in your community can you rely on for specific things, and who can rely on you for specific things, and who do we turn to when we need help? And it's Mimi Kim's work around community accountability. And if you're interested in that idea, there is a 600-page toolkit called the Creative Interventions Toolkit that talks all about how do we help community be in a place where they feel capable of intervening. Because, you know, part of the problem is that, as Lydia said, we have ceded all of our responsibility for harm to the state and said, you know, you deal with it. We don't deal with it anymore. Well, if we want to reclaim some of that responsibility, we have to help people figure out how to do that and how to do it safely and effectively, and not, you know, just Vicky throwing herself in the middle of a controversy. But, you know, thinking about how helping people have the skills and the tools that they need to be Vicky, right? To intervene effectively. And then I think, you know, for me, part of thinking about transformation is thinking about all of the other things we should be doing too. So in my book, I talk about, for example, economics and the relationships of economics to intimate partner violence and to, I think, to sex work and trafficking as well, right? That if you give people economic power, they are not stuck in the same way. But also, if you give people who are doing harm economic stability, they are less likely to use violence, which is something that we don't talk about. Interestingly, during the COVID pandemic, rates of intimate partner violence have gone up, right? They went up a bunch, but they came down early in the pandemic. They came down when the stimulus checks went out. Economic stress is tied to violence. We need to be thinking about that. And I think also, for me, transformative justice is also thinking about prevention and what are the strategies that we can be using to prevent violence before it happens, and putting into place a lot of things that are evidence-based. There is an evidence base for prevention work, so that kids are not having the kinds of adverse childhood experiences that then translate into perpetration of violence as they get older, recognizing, as we've said already, that, you know, it is rare that someone ends up in prison the first time they use violence or are exposed to violence. Most times people have been traumatized and they've done harm. And we have to be kind of get our heads around the idea that people can be two things at the same time. They can have been traumatized and they can also be hurting others. And how do we do the prevention work that we need to do to prevent all of that stuff from happening? So for me, transformative justice is a really great way of thinking about kind of the entire suite of things that we need to be doing to change the way that communities respond to violence, to give communities tools to respond to violence, to take the state out of its oppositional stance. And as Miriam Kaba says all the time, to spend that money in places that are likely to prevent violence and likely to prevent the conditions that send people into the carceral system in the first place. Like, this is not a money-saving venture. This is part of a broader strategy that equips community to do the work in a productive way and in a safe way and in a positive way that we're currently funding the carceral system to do, in a way that destroys communities and embeds racism and sexism and transphobia and all, you know, all of the bad stuff that exists in the world, really embeds them even further in our communities.
Wow, that was a lot packed into a short space of time. So in the time we have remaining, let me just highlight some of the ideas that came out of this last part of talking about transformative justice. So one idea is that restorative justice could be part of transformative justice, but not if it's linked to law enforcement and carceral approaches. It's not restorative, it's not justice if it's seen as a coerced alternative to being put in jail, for example. But there are aspects of restorative justice that, delinked from law enforcement and carceral logics, could be part of a broader idea of transformative justice, which includes community-based approaches, but also might include state-supported approaches, not law enforcement, not carceral-based, but still supported by the state. And then all of you have also mentioned these broader economic and other kinds of social supports and social change that would be needed to create changes in relationships, right? Relationships of power within communities and families that would prevent violence in the first place, and also give both the people who commit harm and those who are experiencing harm ways of relating to each other differently in nonviolent ways. So in the 5 minutes we have before we turn to questions and answers, I wonder if each of you could take some piece of that, because I feel like we packed so much into, a 10-minute conversation at the end, to maybe either give an example or highlight one aspect of it. For example, what does it mean to be community-based, or what does accountability mean? What might be the role of the state? Or what are some economic, concrete economic changes that could be made? Just whatever comes to you in terms of what might be a way to wrap up this section of our conversation before we open it up to Q&A.
I think one helpful way to look at transformative justice, rather than this giant thing that people are like, I don't know what to do, is both Mariam Kaba, whom Leigh just mentioned, who is a longtime prison abolitionist, has done advocacy work against domestic violence, also says that she kind of comes out of the recovering carceral feminism, strain, where she was working in the domestic violence, field, and then was like, why do we keep calling cops on people and it's not working? As well as Ajiris Dixon, who here in New York was one of the co-founders of the Safe Neighborhoods campaign in central Brooklyn, where trans and queer people could find safety in local businesses from whenever they felt physically threatened, when they were walking down the street. Both said that, we have to, transformative justice relies on relationships, so if you don't have relationships in your community, then how do you turn to people in crisis? Because if you think about it, most of the time when people are walking down the street and they see a couple that are arguing, and maybe they're arguing and they seem to maybe be in crisis, most people are like, not my business, it's a domestic dispute. But if you know that those are your neighbors, you might be like, are you guys okay? So again, just do you know the people in your community? And it can start small. You can start by saying hello to the people that you see, all the time. Say hello to the people in your building. If you live in an apartment building, say hello to the people that live on your block. You may never have a prolonged conversation. There's some guy that lives on my block. He's lived on my block for 7-8 years. This is our interaction every time we see each other. Hello, young lady, how you doing? I'm doing okay, how you doing? I'm good, good. Okay, take care of yourself. We don't have a very deep relationship. However, I feel fairly confident that, say, if I were being followed by somebody and I felt threatened and I ran into him, I could be like, this guy is following me. Can you help me? And he would be more willing to help because we have built the 7 years of 3-second dialogues. Similarly, I know everybody who lives in my building, which means I am a lot less hesitant about going and knocking on their doors if I think something is wrong. I had neighbors upstairs who, I guess they moved furniture a lot or something, but the first couple of times I thought that there was a domestic dispute. So I would go charging up there, knocking on the door, and they'd be like, oh, sorry, we're putting a futon together, but but if I didn't know them, I might be a little bit, more wary of being like, hey, is everything okay? And similarly, they also know they can knock on my door. And it doesn't even have to be a crisis. It could just be a hey, I'm going to the store and it's, COVID time, and do you need me to pick up anything so you don't have to do a trip out, an unnecessary trip outside? So building those little relationships before an emergency happens is, we should think of it that way. It's getting to know folks. And Leigh also talked about pod mapping, that the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, put together, which is basically relationships in your life. Who can you ask for $10 if you need to take a taxi to the hospital? The person who will lend you $10 might not be the person who will have your back if you need to go knock on somebody's door. The person who has your back may never ever have $10 to lend you. But kind of figuring out who the people are in your life that you can rely on and for what. And then from there you can kind of build.
Relationships, and that also reminds me of another community-based action, mutual aid. That word just didn't come up in our discussion so far, but maybe in the Q&A that might come up, or people in the audience could look it up. There's lots of toolkits related to mutual aid as well. So we should be going to Q&A. I just want to make sure that Leigh and Lydia, if you had, just a quick thought that you wanted to add to this, and then we can turn it over. I'll let our viewers know that unfortunately I'm going to have to leave for a meeting, but for Q&A. And so let me just say right now, this has just been an honor and a joy to be speaking with you all. But Lydia and Leigh, did you want to add anything?
I was just going to mention mutual aid, actually, kind of building on from what Victoria was saying and what Leigh was saying earlier about transformative justice being part of a raft of things as a community. And I think one of the things that makes prison abolition such a hard sell to people is that we rely on these community-based initiatives to replace it. And we don't have communities that are equipped for that necessarily. We're really relying on this version of a community that we haven't built yet. So as part of this strategy, we need to be building that. Like everything's so individualized at the moment that none of my neighbors have anything to do with where I get food. I go out and get food for my household. We don't have any sort of like collective food resource or cooking. When it comes to healthcare, you go into a hospital a city away. All of this stuff is outside of the community, and as individuals, we're having our own interactions with that. If we had all of these resources inside the community and made it so that we had to actually interact with the people around us on a daily basis as part of our normal life, then transformative justice would not look so out there. It would just be thinking, oh, well, we handle food, we handle infrastructure, we handle healthcare, like we can handle justice and harm within our communities easily.
Yeah, the important point. We need to build our communities before we can have community-based justice. Yeah, Leigh?
And I'll just say very quickly, the Violence Against Women Act. $270 million in the Violence Against Women Act goes to the two largest grant-funded programs, which are specifically designed to aid law enforcement, courts, cops, prosecutors, and community-based agencies to the extent that they are doing the work of law enforcement. Imagine what would happen if we were taking those resources and putting them into different places. We need to be advocating for a non-carceral VAWA.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I think most people probably have never read it and they don't know what's in there. And year after year, money goes to law enforcement and not to these forms of transformative justice we've been talking about. Thanks for adding that. Okay, I'm going to run, but thank you so much for this magnificent panel. I love you all. I'm so grateful for your work. And Claire, I'll turn it over to you. Bye-bye.
So now we will turn it over to Q&A. So send me questions that might be popping up. And I just want to reiterate that for CLE credit, you have to mark the words that were sent out. And if you missed the first one, it was equity, and the second one should be popping up soon. It'll only be available for 2 minutes. Oh, here it is. Okay. So I know we've been jumping around. I haven't received any questions yet, so when those come in, we'll turn to those. But if we want to continue on what practices we as individuals and as a community can cultivate to contribute to lessening our own reliance on policing and incarceration, if that is something you guys want to speak to some more.
So I guess I can start. I think that's one of the hardest questions that exists. And the reason is because currently the only way that we have to address violence in the moment or to achieve anything that anyone calls justice is to go through the criminal legal system. And I guess let me say this to law students, particularly who are watching, or lawyers who are watching. I find it very difficult as a client-centered lawyer to say to a client, you don't get to want the criminal legal system. I know all the reasons why it doesn't work. I know all the reasons why I think it's bad. I know that I think retribution is not a valid reason for using a system. And that being said, when I have clients who say what I want is punishment, it's hard to say to them, no, you shouldn't want that. And I don't think it's my place to do that. So I think that the work that we need to do is to help people see, help people first figure out what their justice goals really are. What is it that I am hoping to accomplish by doing this? And then what's the best way to accomplish that goal? My hope is that over time, if we give people other alternatives to the criminal legal system so that punishment is not the only thing that we understand as justice, people will want it less. I think that that is my hope. So let me say that. And so we're not suggesting, I don't think any of us is suggesting that people don't get to want that. People want what they want. What we're suggesting is that it doesn't work particularly well. And if the reason that they want it is to stop violence, that's not going to work. And so having those conversations with people, I think, is really important. And I can tell you personally, there are times that come up when I have to think about, should I call the police about this or should I not? And I try to work through for myself, what is it that I am hoping to accomplish by calling the police? And am I actually going to accomplish that? And more often than not, the answer is no. I'm not going to accomplish the things I want to accomplish by calling the police. So I'm not suggesting that in the middle of an attack, given that we have nothing else to offer people, you don't call 911. But I will tell you that there are organizations like the Northwest Network out in Seattle who don't have that call 911 message on their answering machine anymore, because for that community, and it primarily serves LGBTQ plus folks, calling police is much more dangerous than dealing with whatever you are dealing with in that moment. And so I guess I would just say, try to, as you think about what it is that you want and what is it you think you're going to accomplish, is calling the police really going to get that for you? Or is it going to open up a whole other host of difficulties that you didn't even think about?
If nobody has anything to add, I have another follow-up question, but I want to leave room. Maybe starting with Lydia, we have a question sort of for you. Can you talk about your understanding of safety and what you think would be helpful community measures, having dealt with these issues firsthand and personally?
Yeah, so I think, not to sound like a liberal feminist, my definition of safety is quite rooted in choice. So the reason I ended up in the sex industry is because I was escaping domestic violence as a teenager, right? And sex work is what gave me the choice to leave. It's the only way I could support myself. But because I had to choose between violence at home and risking violence outside the home as a sex worker, I then didn't really have the choice to leave any violent situations I was in as a sex worker without returning to a violent situation. Like, there was just absolutely no way out for me. And if we look at lots of situations in which violence occurs, so within the sex industry, if you can't afford to say no to a client, you can't really afford to keep yourself safe, right? In domestic violence, if you can't afford to leave, if your money is being controlled, you don't have the choice to. So for me, safety is not, I don't think there's ever going to be a world in which harm doesn't exist, right? But if we make sure people always have the option to move places, to leave jobs, to leave certain people behind, make sure that we are building a system in which everyone has the resources for that, then I think that's the closest thing to safety we're going to get, because lots of us end up trapped in violent situations. And I think having this sort of material support in place makes people safe, in the sense that when harm happens, people are more empowered to deal with it in a way that feels right for them. Because dealing with a violent act when you have absolutely no social connections, you have no money, you have no other options but to stay in the situation you're in, there's nothing you can do. But if I had the option to leave my job, which I hate, that'd be great. if I had the option to pay for healthcare in order to access therapy, which is actually quite hard to come by in the UK, even though we have the NHS, that would be me being able to deal with it. So I think, yeah, safety comes from giving us the option to leave a situation that we're uncomfortable with, no matter what.
Does anyone have anything to add to that? I have plenty more questions coming in at this point, but thank you for that, Lydia.
One quick add-on
Yeah.
to what Lydia said is, I don't know if everybody here is a lawyer, if there are if some of the people who are listening are in positions to offer employment, but taking a page from, like from efforts to decrease recidivism and ending mass incarceration, if you have the opportunity to employ somebody, like, don't let barriers like they're convicted of sex work, or they're, they have an arrest history or conviction history, stop you from doing so. Like, if you have the ability to say, like, I can, like, I have this job position, for, I don't know, whatever, like, whatever your job and your business is, like, look to hire people who perhaps, like, that is their economic escape from whatever, situation that they're in. And don't be like, oh no, I don't want this person because they have a lengthy arrest history, for sex work, or for, substance use, or for, whatever. Because I think that also that is one of the barriers that society has set up and ingrained in people who have economic opportunities to offer, is you don't want these people to have economic opportunities. You want to keep them in that marginalized position. So for those of you who work in law firms, or, other places where you might hire other people, please keep that in mind.
So here's a great question. Can anyone discuss the relationship between the anti-violence movement and the school to prison pipeline, in particular focusing on maybe the criminalization of disability and mental illness?
So I can at least get us started by suggesting that one of the significant problems with the anti-violence movement is its failure to consider the impact of its actions on other movements, including the school to prison pipeline. And so if you look at the history of the anti-violence movement, we have not, and I say we because I'm part of it, we have not played well with others. And we have not been thoughtful about the positions that we've taken and how those positions impact others. So here's an example. In Maryland versus King, which was a Supreme Court case that set up the DNA database system and allowed for the establishment of the DNA database system, the anti-violence movement filed briefs that said, this is fantastic because DNA databases are going to give us the ability to find rapists, and that's all good. And did not acknowledge the ways in which doing so would harm disproportionately marginalized communities, particularly communities of color in the United States, just never even acknowledged it. And that's because the anti-violence movement has been largely tone deaf to the concerns of people of color, particularly women of color, since its inception. And so when you look at the early history of the anti-violence movement, you see primarily, but not all, white feminists saying, we need greater carceral involvement, this is why. And you see women of color saying, this is not going to be good for our communities, and here's why. And so for me, the impact on school to prison pipeline is not dissimilar. One of the great innovations of the anti-violence movement, and again, air quotes, has been mandatory arrest. And the idea that because police in the 60s and 70s were failing to make arrests in cases of domestic violence, the response to that should be to remove police discretion and require them to make arrests anytime that they had probable cause to do so. And mandatory arrest led to higher arrest rates, mostly for women more than anyone else. But the interesting piece, school to prison pipeline wise, was around the arrests of girls. mandatory arrest led to huge increases in arrest rates of girls, leading directly to girls' involvement in the juvenile justice system, which made them then more vulnerable to involvement in the adult carceral system. So even though it's not a clear, like this had this a clear link, absolutely. Policies that have been championed by the anti-violence movement have led to the increased criminalization of girls and of others. There's just not, it's undeniable. In terms of thinking about like the disability rights movement and mental health movements, I think similarly, the mainstream anti-violence movement has not been thoughtful about the impact of its actions on other communities or really solicited the input of other communities. Folks have always said, wait, this is not going to work for us, but you don't see that reflected as much as you should in the policies that have been championed by the mainstream anti-violence movement. Because if you did, they wouldn't be championing a carceral system that has disproportionate impacts on all of those communities.
So I think we have to wrap up, but thank you so much for participating on this panel. I can't thank you enough. And I just want everyone to know that this recording will be made available via email after, because you registered. So that's gonna be around after. Thank you again, Victoria.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Claire for putting this panel discussion together. As a couple of reminders, please make sure you fill out your CLE evaluation form if you're seeking CLE for today's event. The evaluation form is mandatory in order to get you those credits. If you missed those keywords, the first one was equity and the second one was freedom. I will drop in the chat right now the CLE evaluation form if you do not see it on your email. And thank you for all of you who've joined us throughout the week. This was our last noontime panel discussion for Public Interest Week this year. There have been wonderful discussions. I hope you all have enjoyed them as much as I have. We do have one more evening event tonight, which is decolonizing the stacks and looking at the role of decolonizing the library in various law schools. So we invite you to join us for that. And all day tomorrow for our 40th annual Spare Symposium, which is talking about reimagining freedom, abolition as a practice. Throughout the day, we have 4 different panels that will talk about abolitionist frameworks for different areas of social society. So thank you so much for all of you for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists, to our students for putting this all together. And we hope you have enjoyed this event. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.